Hello, this is Jill Marshall, author, editor and publisher, and your facilitator for the online program for How to Write Children's Books. This is an extra piece for the module on narrative voice, that's module 6. So I taught a lot in that module about the use of narrative voice, and now here I am using my own voice, my speaking voice, to communicate some more with you on this issue of reading aloud. There are various instances throughout your author's career where you might need or be expected to read aloud. So I just wanted to introduce you to them and also give you a few hints and tips on how to do it effectively so that you don't get too nervous about it, so that it really has the impact that you require. So the first instance is as now, where I've been asking you to read aloud your exercises, your writing. And I honestly do read whole books at a time aloud so that I can make sure that the flow is okay. So here's what you're doing. You're listening to it. You're listening to how those words flow, whether there's any pieces that are too dense, where you might need to take out some words, where the dialogue is pithy and interesting, or where it's maybe going on a little bit too long, or where the pace is too slow or too fast. Sometimes you can find that you're just breathless, having rattled through a piece of dialogue, and that you need to come back down to earth a little bit. So reading aloud is a very, very useful exercise. And it's also one of those times when you'll start to get a physical reaction, which is my best gauge for working out whether a story is really working or not. So that physical reaction might be the hairs going up on the back of your neck or up your arms. For me, I get a tickling sensation in my solar plexus and a sort of hit in the sternum. So it can be difficult, but it's physical. And it's often when I read work aloud, and I read other people's work aloud as well, that you first get that indication, that physical indication that something's really hitting the mark, or that perhaps there's more work to be done. Now, obviously, you may have had you been on a physical workshop rather than an online one, had to read your work aloud to other students. And that's sometimes terrifying. And you won't have had the opportunity to do that because you're working online. So I really, really encourage you to get into the discipline of reading your work aloud to yourself. Lock the door, hide yourself away in an office or the bathroom or the shed or wherever you need to do it in order to not feel silly. And then read it aloud, gauge that reaction, and it's a form of editing, really, so that you can start to really get your hands around how that book is sounding. Because do bear in mind, of course, that particularly with a children's book, the likelihood is that at some point, some parent, some caregiver, some teacher, some grandparent will read your book aloud to their students or their wards. So you're checking ahead of time that it's going to work for them in that instance. And you're also getting a real sense of how that book is hanging together. So that's the first time you may read aloud. The second time is a little bit about what I was just referring to. Had you been on a physical workshop and then had to read aloud to your fellow students. And that's if you were to join a writers group or a critique group or some form of forum where you have to exhibit your work in order to get some feedback on it. And often this is done by reading aloud. Now, what I often hear, and it happens all the time, and I'm sure I've done it myself, is that people will shuffle around and stare at the paper and will then say, oh, it's not very good, and I'm not really ready, and I haven't done enough work, and I'm not sure what this character's doing. But anyway, and then they begin. Now that to me is a little like putting a plate of food in front of somebody, which they're thoroughly delighted to have received, and then saying, I'm not a really good cook. I didn't have a recipe and half the ingredients were missing, and I think I probably burnt it. It's going to taste awful, but anyway. So you have predisposed your audience to dislike this plate of food or potentially your story. So there's a different way to do it, and that is just confidently. Now, when I was young, there was a TV program on called Jackanory. And in Jackanory, some celebrity would come onto the set. They would sit comfortably in their high winged chair. They would stare straight at the camera, smile, and then they would say the title of the book and the author. Then with nothing else, they would turn the page and start reading. So there's no preamble, there's no apology, there's nothing to describe the book and give a synopsis and explain the setting. It's simply that. You sit up straight or stand up if you need to. You smile. You state the title. Now, obviously, if you're the author, you'll probably not need to say who you are, but if you do, then do so. And then you just turn the page and start reading confidently. Even if you are feeling anything but confident about it. Just that delivery is going to make the work sound so much better. And if you then get feedback that it's not that great, then at least you've done your best job of presenting it, and you can accept that the feedback is genuine. Whereas if you've ambled on beforehand about how bad it's going to be, then you are tempting everybody to just agree with you. So you won't actually know how genuine that feedback is. So that's just my little tip for how to read to critique groups, to writers groups, to perhaps your readers groups and so on. And that is, take the Jackanory style. Just sit up straight, smile, say the title, start reading. And then, in similar vein, we come on to the third and potentially most exciting time that you're going to have to read your work aloud, and that is when you're reading it to your fans, when it's been published and when you've been asked to go somewhere and communicate with the audience and read a little bit of your book. Obviously, they will be expecting you to read a little bit of your book, but do bear in mind that it is a little bit. Now, believe me, I know this from personal experience. It's very hard to keep going when you've decided to read a chapter, the first chapter of your book, because that's an obvious place to start, and you've noticed that it's a very warm room, and it's the end of the school day, and the kids are getting a bit twitchy and agitated, and some of the teachers are dropping off. So then you're just aware of the environment, and suddenly you can't wait to get to the end of that chapter, and you notice that there's still 3 or 4 pages to go, and what are you going to do? So actually you grind to a halt is what you generally do, and you've stopped in middle of nowhere. You haven't really given the best demonstration of the excitement and the intrigue of your story, and there's no flavour of your characters either. So my advice for if and when you get to go and talk to your local library who have asked you to come in because you're such a stellar children's writer, or a school, or perhaps a bookshop where you've got fans coming in to buy and get you to sign your books. And it's this, just keep it really short. Pick a little piece of your book, and it may not be the beginning. It may be somewhere further in. It may be close to the end. And what you're looking for is probably no more than about a page and a half, by which we're looking at around 300-400 words, no more than that. And cut them out if you need to, not in the book itself, but in your little editing process before you start talking. And test it out for yourself by reading it aloud, which is what I wish I'd done when I first started doing this, and I just planned to read a chapter and discovered that that was going to work. So choose a little piece and make sure that it gives all those listeners, because they're not readers at this stage, give all those listeners a chance to really get involved in your story, start to love a character perhaps, and then leave them on a cliffhanger, leave them wanting more. Because obviously what you want them to do is to love it so much, that little piece, that they then have to go and pick up the book. So choose a little piece, and if you have any gimmicky things going on in your book, a particular character who sings songs, or there's something quite specific about a particular situation or a setting or something, then use that. So for instance, in my case, having gone through the whole, I'll read a chapter and then I'll try half a chapter and then I'll just try a page or two, what I actually do now is I don't read the book at all. For Jane Blonde, I just use some of G Mama's raps. So I will literally get half the room stamping their feet and being the bass line. I'll get half the room clapping their hands and being the cymbal or the hi-hat, and then I will rap over the top, and then once they've got used to it, they'll join in and do the rapping. So it's a tiny little section of the whole of the Jane Blonde story, but what you've done is engage the audience. So you do have to remember at this stage that it's a bit of a performance. And not everybody's comfortable with performing to that degree, but believe me, you will make it so much easier for yourself. If you're slightly nervous about talking in front of a crowd, it will be much, much easier if you choose a small, manageable piece. You edit it beforehand and make sure that you've read it aloud a couple of times, and then it's entertaining and pithy and ends at a point where the listeners will have to read more, and then you might not enjoy the performance, but you will get through it. Whereas you may not if you decide just to read a chapter because you are so nervous about it you can't really think about it, and then you start to spot what's going on in the audience. So 3 instances where you may read aloud. Now, the one time I would not recommend reading aloud is if you are writing a picture book or a very young reader, and especially if it's in rhyme. The reason being, and obviously rhyme is meant to be read aloud, but if you read it aloud and you haven't had it checked over and edited, then it could be that you're glossing over certain parts of the rhyme, certain meters, certain tenses, and so on, that don't actually work. They only work when you say it. So the importance of getting rhyme right is to make sure that it works on the page for whoever reads it. So while you will have tremendous fun once that's all been edited and clarified, reading alongside of the children that you're reading to, in those early stages, when you're trialing it, read it aloud to yourself by all means, but then get it thoroughly checked by somebody else as to how it looks on the page, because that's going to be what the next reader, who will be a parent or a teacher or a caregiver, will have to translate for you. So there we are, a little bit more about reading aloud. Enjoy choosing and using your narrative voices, and really, really enjoy using your own speech.